Hey everybody, Tim as usual. So as you probably heard by now, Joe Matt passed away this past week, and in observance of that, we decided to rerun our 2015 episode where Koom and Kumar talked about Joe Matt's The Poor Bastard. So here it is, commercial free. Enjoy.
This is Kumar.
This is Koom.
And this is Deconstructing Comics. Welcome to Deconstructing Comics. This is Kumar and Koom. We're in Toronto at Koom's apartment. TCAF finished yesterday.
Absolutely.
And it was amazing.
Awesome. It was excellent.
So we're going to talk about Joe Matt's The Poor Bastard, which is the first Peep Show collection.
Technically, it's not. The first one is his strips, and it's the one-pagers, which later became two-pagers.
Hang on, so were the one-pagers in Peep Show?
They were called Peep Show, so it might get confusing.
Okay, well, this is collected Peep Show 1 to 6.
Yes.
So there was a different Peep Show Volume 1.
Yes.
Okay, this is Peep Show Volume 2.
Right.
Okay, I don't know. We, as with every Deconstructing Comics episode, we went back and forth, I think, on a lot of subjects. Possible subjects. Somehow we landed on this one. Okay, so where to start? So Joe Matt was American, but he was living in Canada illegally. He's
from Pennsylvania, maybe Philadelphia.
Okay.
But definitely Penn.
But he was part of that triumvirate of him and Chester Brown and Seth, and they were all characters in each other's comics.
They were called the Toronto Three, and I have to say that I don't think Joe ever appeared in Seth's comics, but Seth appears very prominently in Joe's. Chester appears briefly in Seth's early stuff, before Clyde fans, and both Joe and Seth do appear in Paying For It by Chester.
Yes.
Because Joe calls Chester a whoremonger.
Right.
Yes.
Right. Okay. And the other thing was, to jump way ahead, but there is a tie-in to TCAF, because after reading this, I was wondering what the hell happened to Joe Matt.
Right.
And we were lucky enough to run into Chester Brown yesterday.
Yeah.
And I asked him, this is my chance, I can ask him what is going on with Joe Matt. And apparently he's just reached a creative block and is not cartooning at the moment. And he's back in the States anyway, he's not here.
Yeah, I mean, for me, like you were saying, why are we doing this? I think partly we're doing this because I reread all of Joe's comics, which I had in comics form. I never even had the collection, The Poor Bastard.
Right.
So I kind of knew these guys a little bit in the 90s, or at least I'd met with them a few times. And I did my class on comics last year, and Chester came and talked to my students. He was very agreeable. So we asked him about Joe, and so he kind of talked about Joe a little bit. And he said he felt it's a pity that Chester and Seth have become very well respected and have done well and so on, and he feels that Joe should be right there with him, but because Joe hasn't really been able to put out comics for more than 10 years, I think, he feels that he's being neglected. And I think it's interesting. I mean, we could talk more about that later, but that figures in his book as to what he's doing and where that's taking him as a cartoonist in his life.
I think too, but I think Joe's work is, it's autobiographical, more so than Seth or Chester until, a lot of Chester's is autobiographical, but Joe Matt never made a Ed the Happy Clown. I mean, he never did it. Did you get that?
He lampoons it a little bit. I wish you'd read the Peep Show strips, because he lampoons it a little bit, where he's kind of more cartoony, and he creates this character called Dregs or something like that, and he's like this little walking egg that kind of is. And it's funny because Chester said that he was inspired to go into autobiographical stuff like the Playboy because of
Joe's work.
Because of Joe's work.
Sure.
But then I think Joe was trying to do stuff kind of a little bit like Chester's to some degree.
But I think even if he was still consistently producing work, I think Joe's work, as great as it is sleazy. And I think that sleaziness is going to cut him off from...
That's a big part of this, and I think we have to discuss this. Yeah.
Right. Well, this is okay. So we have to. So basically, it's almost like.
Let's start with the sleaziness because I don't.
Okay. Well, that's what it is. It is the sleaziness because it's basically about Joe's desire, his lusting after a certain physical type of woman. He has very specific things about hair color, head shape. Every little thing is very specific about it. He's very shallow about it, and he thinks about these women and he masturbates about them. And then he has a girlfriend. They're in a horrible relationship right at the beginning, and he meets her friends and he's lusting after her, and then he cartoons about it, and then in the next issue, which is like a year later, it's like, okay, somebody found out about it, and there's all this back and forth, and then the next girl comes along that he's lusting after, and then there's more masturbating, and he's like, how can I get a VCR so I can watch porn? And that's like a lot of what the book revolves around. Now the first time I read this, 97 or 98, I really liked it, and this time I read it, and at the start I was like, whoa, this is kind of terrible. Like, he clocks his girlfriend in the eye, gives her a black eye, and it's like a one panel throwaway. It's almost like a gag. It's like, oh, I gave my girlfriend a black eye. We don't see the punch, we just hear about it, and we see it. We see the black eye, of course. And they're just miserable. And I thought the first issue was really like, oh my, is this really going to go on for like 5 more issues? But then it kind of
fizzles out very fast.
That relationship ends, and everything improves, including, I think, the quality of the storytelling improves.
Right.
Everything gets better. Not his life necessarily, but it's funnier, I think, as it goes along. Whereas the first issue I found was really depressing and not as funny.
Well, let me respond to that. I think part of the issue for me is because I read this stuff. I didn't read his strips when they appeared in various anthologies, but I got the collection because there was a poster kind of commemorating his cheapness, which is one of the one page. It was like all these different ways to be cheap.
Okay.
Some of them were kind of ridiculous, and some of them were kind of interesting, like wash your clothes in the wash tub, and I'll go to art show openings so you can like take food. And anyway, and I thought it was hilarious, so I bought the book, and it was just fascinating because they start off being more kind of fast and funny and amateurish, but as they go on, he starts to date Trish. He moves up to Montreal to live with her because he's from the States, as you know. Trish's sister is Diana Schutz.
Okay.
So that's how they were introduced, because Joe Matt went to school with the guy who did Mage, The Reckoning. What's his name? Matt Wagner, right?
Mage? Isn't it Mage?
All right, Mage, whatever.
Is it Mage?
No.
Have I been wrong about this?
No, I just pronounce things wrong all the time. It's Mage. I just always called it Mage in my mind.
Interesting.
When I was a kid, I didn't know what the word meant, and I'd see those comics everywhere, and I'd call it Mage for me. But anyway, so Matt was going out with Dinah Schutz's second sister. And so they got Trish and Joe together.
Okay.
And then there's this whole thing about them being in love, and that's a big thing. And then there's a lot of strips about, them about farting in bed or little idiosyncrasies and things like that. But as they get more serious, and as he does longer strips, and as he moves towards the end of the book, it climaxes with one of their recurring fights. And you get this feeling that there's fighting, and then she breaks up with him, but then they get back together, and it happens a lot. And the climax he has is she stabs him with a pair of scissors, or she tries to stab him with a pair of scissors, and he stays out all night.
Right.
And then they get back together and they try to make it work, and then they have a fight about whether he's going to include this in his latest strip or not.
Right.
And she doesn't want it but then he agrees with the proviso, or she agrees with the proviso, that she can give her own version and so sort of insert herself.
Right.
So already you have this kind of rocky kind of thing set in place at the end of this first collection.
Yeah.
And all of the themes are in there, plus the pornography. And you got to remember, you have to discuss this book as a book of its time, because as I reread it last night, I realized, my God, 20 years have passed and certain things have changed. And one of the things that's changed is that we read them as comics. And so there was a natural flow between the end of that strip and the beginning of his work with Drawn and Quarterly, where these were episodes. These weren't, I don't think he had a vision of them as a collection until like 6 issues in.
Yeah.
And people weren't really kind of looking at graphic novels that way back then. And the other thing was the porn issue, right? Like he'd kind of gotten readers by being very exposed about his life.
Sure.
And the porn was like at the center of it.
Yeah.
And back then, like now you can like download porn, you can watch porn, you can like, it's much more accessible. And I think in that way, it's become sort of more grudgingly accepted, whereas back then you had to go to a store, you had to rent something, there was something shameful, much more secret and hidden about it. And it was evident that it was affecting their relationship because it was like this big character defect. Whereas now I don't think, like, I mean, I'm not a porn consumer, but I've known people who are, and I think it's much more habitual and even like much more integrated.
Well, it certainly went up and then down and up, because in the 70s you had to go to a cinema with a bunch of other people. It was very public. And then it became the kind of secretive 80s, and then now in the 2000s it's like everybody's looking at it on the internet. So it's not, you're not going to a theater, but everybody knows everybody's doing it. So there's less shame associated with it or whatever.
But people loved his comic because he would kind of, it was like the sensationalism of it was that he would, so he was well aware of that, and I think he is a talented, practitioner of the art. Like, he loves comics, but he would highlight certain things and he would present himself, I think, in a certain way. But at the same time, that couldn't help but interact with his real life. It couldn't help but interact with the people who were his friends, who he was dating. And so it has this weird incestuous kind of thing.
Okay, let's talk about that thing with the scissors or the knife that she's having. That's interesting because
scissors, not knife. 3
or 4 issues later, somebody has read issue 1, and they're like, "Is it true that you gave your girlfriend a black eye?" And he's like, "Well, she beat me up all the time anyway, or as well." So, but when you read that, you're like, I don't know whether to believe him or not, or if he's just lying to this girl because he's.
But if you were a reader back then,
you would know. The problem is this book is not called Peep Show number 2. It's called The Poor Bastard, as if it's a standalone.
That's it. And I think in that way, unlike, say, Seth's A Good Life If You Don't Weaken, it's not really the same thing.
We kind of ran into the same problem with Cerebus, where we found it was better if you read them a month apart. That there was a certain relationship which existed, that it made more sense if a year had passed instead of 20 minutes since you read the last issue.
And the other thing you don't have in these is you don't have the letters. And I would say out of all of the letters in Drawn and Quarterly, Joe's were the most fascinating, because just like in the book, he kind of sensationalized or tried to deprave the aspects of his life. The letters in his column would get more and more increasingly abusive, and just like people would insult him, and he would just publish them. And to the point where I can't imagine it would be fun for him, but he was trapped in this kind of not formula exactly, but in this kind of setting that he'd made for himself in his comic.
Yeah, well, this is another thing about it too, and I said before, he never did an Ed the Happy Clown or It's a Good Life, which was actually fiction.
Yeah.
Or at least that cartoonist that Seth was talking about was fictional.
Except he is in it too.
Right. Well, I think the interesting thing about this to me was, I guess it's true for a lot of artists or cartoonists or filmmakers, but he's okay. So a month. How many hours are in a week or a month? And he's isolated into 6 panels per page for 30 pages, right?
That's his choice at this point.
Right. Okay. So he's but he's choosing moments,
Right.
singular moments. And how does he choose those moments? He looks back over his past month or his past few weeks or months or whatever, and he's like, this moment is going in there, this moment's going in there. But he's picking out very neurotic, extreme behavior. Maybe I shouldn't characterize it that way.
It's neurotic. There's no way you can.
So like he's like, remember? It's almost like, remember that time I rented those videos and tried to jerk off 10 times in a row, and then he puts that in there. So for him to be able to choose that moment and put that in means he recognizes that there's something wrong about his own behavior or something off center about his own behavior, and he puts those in. And the thing that really, especially in that first issue of it, to me was, if he recognizes that those behaviors are antisocial or something, why isn't he ever trying to correct them?
He does try, and the thing is, he's an addict. I do believe he's an addict. And I can tell you an anecdote that sort of ties into this. But anyway, he is an addict, and part of what he does is he tries to chronicle it, because you see there's a difference between, in my opinion, there's a difference between him when he's in a spell of watching, those porn tapes. Like, I don't think it's in this, but there's a later one where he even edits together his best hits.
This is, I feel like I read an excerpt of this in something. I feel like this is the thing that was in McSweeney's or something we were talking about yesterday.
But
he edits together tapes. This is in back days where you have to have 2 VCRs. And he jerks off and he's like, yes, 6 times in a row or something like that. And I remember I heard an interview with him on Ink Studs, I think maybe 2 years ago or something, and he had gone this Buddhist path or something, and he had gone completely clean. Like,
he had to, because he was an addict, and
but beyond the point, like, just his behavior to people, and the way he talks about,
you're right,
I like this type of woman, she's got to have this type of hair and this type of teeth and this type of butt. And Seth is like, what the hell is wrong with you? He knows something is wrong with him because he chose to put that panel in there. He himself is made to look the fool in his own comic. So he knows there's something wrong with him behaving that way. And he knows there's something ridiculous about it. But it's not like, actually, I'm gonna try to be more open-minded or something.
What I was trying to say was, I think, okay, so there's him as an addict, or like him as like using people, or him as ripping people off, or chasing after his nostalgia collector, all of that stuff, right? There's him in his life. But then there's some time when he sits at the table and he says, I'm going to put out my comic. And he puts a lot of time and effort into, it's not like some random thing. I did read stuff back in the 90s, I won't say names, where people just vomited out their, autobiographical stuff. And it wasn't very memorable. It wasn't interesting. It wasn't well edited. But I think he puts a lot of attention into composing his panels, working stuff out. And let me finish. And so what he's doing is he's taking that stuff.
Yeah.
Because he sees this as something that other people aren't doing, and I can push this, and it sort of becomes like his artistic material, right? It becomes his dough, and people are fascinated by it, but he can't hold it for long. And then he does that other story, because his life starts crumbling because of this. He does that other story where they're children. He does Fair Weather, which is a beautiful story. It deals with some of the same themes, but it's removed. And he comes back, and then he does the issues which later got collected and spent, but there's only 4 issues, and they're coming at greater and greater times apart. And much of it is about him watching the porn. He has no girlfriend. There's some odd appearances by Seth and Chester, but mostly it's him trying to grapple with that, and he can't do anything with it at that point, artistically or creatively, and it just feels like the book just trails off into nothing. It gets collected and spent, but it shouldn't be, because it never really gets finished.
Right.
It doesn't have a direction, and then he just sort of disappears, whereas Chester and Joe, the other members of the Toronto Three, end up slowly working on their stuff and then becoming recognized and then becoming part of other institutions like the library or the museum, and then he kind of gets left behind. But the odd thing is, I discovered those guys through him. He was the most accessible of the 3. He was the most funny of the 3, and for me, if not for his work, I wouldn't have discovered all that stuff by Drawn and Quarterly and the stuff on the fringes.
Right.
Plus,
my access point was at the Happy Clown. That was my jam. That got me into the.
I discovered Ed because of him.
Right. Okay.
I would say.
I think for me it was the other way around. What about the? So he gets this roommate. He ends up after he breaks up with Trish.
The 19-year-old. No, after Chubsy Wubsy moves out.
Right. Okay. Well, that's the roommate. That's the roommate I want to talk about. So he's got this roommate who won't stop talking. So Joe is avoiding him. And
Joe the happy clown. Joe the sad clown.
Joe is peeing in a jar in his room because he doesn't want to go out into the hall and run into this guy and have to have a conversation with him.
But my whole point is, I think Joe's doing Joe the sad clown.
Right. Now, okay.
He's doing a version of himself.
Yes. Okay. So this is the question we always get to in these things is how much is it really? There's another panel before we get to that where he actually goes to the bathroom and he pees in the sink. And that's never explained.
It's true,
that's never unpacked, right?
Because if you
why did he pee in the sink? Was he trying to save money on flushing?
No, it's in the earlier stuff.
Okay.
Partly it's to avoid other people. Partly it's to be lazy, especially Chubsy Wubsy. He hates having to go through the shared space and running.
Yeah, but he has to go to the bathroom and he pees in the sink in the bathroom.
Yeah, he likes doing it. There's a great thing where Seth says all the things I think you should know about Joe Matt at the end of his first collection. He does a 2-pager. Okay. And I think in one of the panels, there are all these tiny panels where he just rants, and he goes, in one of them, he goes, I think that bastard peed in our sink. And it's after this anecdote about how they had to share a hotel room, but there were only 2 beds when they were at a convention. Okay. And so they flip coins as to who would have to share one bed and who gets to sleep in the other bed alone. And I forget who it was. I think it was like Seth and Joe had to sleep together. I'm just making this up, but I think it was Seth and Joe. And Joe tries something like, I can't sleep next to Seth because of his cigarette breath. It keeps me up. And so what the other 2 agree is Seth gives up the single bed to Chester. No, how does it work? Chester gives up the single bed to Seth, just so that they won't let Joe take advantage of them and get the single bed. And then he finishes it up with, and I think that bastard peed in the sink. It was like they were so used to it. And in terms of how real is it, I think it's absolutely real. Like Seth once said, people meet Joe and they think the construct in his comics is kind of fake, and then he takes advantage of them. And then Seth said, but Joe puts all that stuff out in his comics. Why would you be surprised? So it's real. It's just I think he uses it as his thing. And
there has to be a level of exaggeration because especially in the later issues when it starts getting really funny. That's through 3, 4, 5, and 6. I was like, this guy is making things more ridiculous than they actually.
It's not that he's making them more ridiculous. It's the timing and what he's picking and choosing, and that's why
There's a choice.
His craft is good because it's funny and it's well timed, and the storytelling is he'll be like, "I'll never call her again," and then the next panel will be like, "Trish, take me." All of his influences, all of those comic strips that I knew nothing about, he obsessively collected those. Yeah, just like Seth. Yeah. It's just that aspect of his life didn't really show up. But D&Q reprinted all those Gasoline things because he had scrapbooks of those original.
Oh, Gasoline Alley ones, yeah.
Yeah, no, he knew that stuff really well. And, the Woody Allen comes out a little bit, but he loves movies. He loves humor. And he's working that. The problem is that the stuff he uses is this most depraved stuff he can get. And then that kind of actually unravels.
Okay, so let's say I often think about this when you're thinking about a movie that's a biopic. So you got 90 minutes out of a person's life, or 120 minutes.
Or let's say Woody Allen, because he mentions Woody Allen. I think he's trying to be Woody Allen because Woody Allen always kind of used to play the same type, and he would do this thing.
There's Crumb in there too.
There's Crumb. Sure. He loves Crumb.
For sure.
He loves Crumb. Crumb's a huge inspiration. But I think, instead of being like Woody Allen, he ends up becoming a bit more like Larry David or somebody like that, where Larry David plays a version of himself that's kind of true, because Larry is difficult. He's trumping those things up.
Yeah, I was thinking of Larry David too, but that's pushed... That character, the Larry David character, is a very extreme version.
Because it's surreal.
Yeah, and if you ever
surreal.
listen to an interview with real Larry David, he's always like, "No, I'm not like that, because you can't get through life if you act like that." And I think I'm just wondering, the Joe Matt that we don't see out of, so we've got 90 minutes of this guy's life, and then there's thousands of other hours. Is that guy basically a normal, well-adjusted guy?
I don't think so. I think he's a very unhappy, but like he rolls with it and uses it as much as he can. There would be like letters in his letter column saying, you need therapy. Or once a therapist wrote in and said, I could like treat you over the phone, and then his response to her was, thanks, I'll just keep my money anyway, kind of thing. But I think the reason why he hasn't produced is because he's not able, like he did go to the States to try to make a TV show.
Hang on, he's not producing, but we also know that he's cleaned up. Do you think there's a connection? I mean, we're speculating wildly here.
I don't know. That's the first I've heard of it, and I would say if there is truth to that, that would have come after he was already unable to produce. I think his trying to make Peep Show into an HBO show was because he couldn't he couldn't conclude that last storyline. He didn't know where to take it. Also, the stories were kind of frustrating. The letters, comments were getting more and more irate. Like, why are you charging this money? You're a sad sack of shit.
Right.
And at first, it was kind of funny. But whereas Tomine, I don't know if you read the letters in the early Optic Nerves, he somehow kept himself at a distance, and they were kind of funny, the letters he would pick. But he kind of became more embroiled, I think, in the whole stuff he was doing. And see, this is the thing I think that's most interesting. When I last saw Chester, it was after rereading the stuff, and we were talking about Joe, and I remembered how much I loved these, and I said, the thing about Joe is, in the same way that he'll use people, he'll rip them off or whatever. I mean, part of this as a kid is he's ripped off some kid and trades comic books and trading comic books, and the kid doesn't know the value, and so the kid wants to beat him up. And, it's the same theme, but as a kid, right? In the same way that it does that, he kind of uses his friendships or his relationship material, and he uses that as grist for making his comics or making money. So he uses them in that way, and it makes people increasingly uncomfortable, because in a later issue of Peep Show, Seth says, I don't want to be in this anymore, take me out. Whereas Seth is much more prominent as an antagonist or a foil than, say, Chester. And so obviously Trish, too, kind of got sick of it. So unfortunately, it becomes good comics for him, but it affects his relationship. So there's almost an inverse relationship between the material and either his relationships or his life, as you put it. And so once the comics became poor and he no longer did them, maybe his life got a chance to do better, or maybe he just hit rock bottom and there was nowhere else to go but up. I don't know, but I think that's what's kind of difficult about this stuff, because people were fascinated by it, and at the same time they loved to either pity him or loathe him, or Julie Doucette called him a total creep back in the 90s. It was
right.
It was this interesting thing, But I ran into him only a couple of times through Seth. I don't know if this is interesting. I can't think about this stuff without thinking about it. Is that okay? Or...
Yeah.
So, in the mid-90s, I started reading their stuff, and I read Seth's Pelucco, and I wanted to be in comics somehow, but I didn't know. I was only about 19 or 20 years old. But because back then they were still kind of relatively small time, they put their own addresses for the letters column. They didn't have a mailbox. And so they lived in Toronto, and I went up to Seth's door and I knocked on his door. And it sounds so stupid now, but I said, can I learn about comics from you by helping you with your comics? I'll work on the backgrounds or stuff. In my head, I thought
doing the blacks.
I'll draw clouds for you. Idiotic. But he was really kind, and he was, he was up to his eyeballs in illustration work, because that's how he was surviving. And he said, I'll meet you for a series of coffees, and I'll give you some tips or whatever. and you can work on your own stuff. And so I tried, but my comics were like, I never really had the skill or the horsepower to do good comics. But he'd look at it, whatever I did, or he'd give me a little assignment, and then he'd use that as a launching pad to just kind of getting me to think about design or composition or storytelling or structure, and he'd like photocopy stuff and give it to me, like influences, like stuff I'd never heard of. But the way he would do that is we'd meet at the jet fuel where those guys tended to meet. At least that was one of their stomping grounds, like every couple of months or something like that. And then usually somebody else would be there, like in conversation with him. Sometimes it'd be Joe, Chester, both of them, or another friend. And so I said to Joe, I'd really love to buy one of those old strips from you, because he'd have like tons of little panels in them. It was just like a whole, And back then, those, like an average comics page was like 200 max. It was like, whatever. And then he said, like there's so much work put in them. It's like 4 pages in one or 5 pages in one. I want $600 or whatever for them. And I can't afford them. Like, I'm like 19 years old or 20. And so, I said to Seth, like, I think he's just trying to con me. And Seth's like, yeah, Joe's the kind of person, like, he's the kind of salesman where you show interest in something and the price suddenly,
right,
jumps. But then I was taking film studies courses. And so back then I had bought a VCR, and it was a lot of money. It was like $400 or whatever. So I could watch video cassettes to, know some of these movies they were talking about in class. And then I thought, okay, well, maybe I can use this in a trade. And not really, I knew about his porn problem, but it hadn't been documented as much as it's documented in the later issues, right?
Yeah.
And so, or I just wasn't smart enough to realize. So I said to Joe, I could give you like the VCR in trade, and I could give you $200 on top of that, or whatever it was back then. And Joe said, I'm not really sure. And then I didn't think any more about it, but then Seth called me out of the blue, which was very unusual because he never did that. And he said, look, you cannot give Joe a VCR. It's like handing an alcoholic a drink.
Whoa.
You cannot do this. And I said, oh my God, I'm so sorry. I felt mortified. But like that's when it first really like sunk in that this is a serious problem. And also the fact that Joe is the kind of person who does like he's not exaggerating these things to be like playfully charming or to be a jokester. It's like he's using these things, but with the extent of his craft to deal with them. And that was his ambition for his last storyline, was he said that, to document the up and down seesaw trials and tribulations of being an addict.
Yeah, but I still think he's choosing notable moments. I don't know. Like, I wonder if he ever did something. I don't know how to put it. Was he the nice stuff he did? Like,
he's really romantic too. That's the thing. You read it and you think, like, why?
Is he?
Yeah, because in his own mind, he has this ideal, but he wants to, like, that early stuff with Trish. Like when he first meets her, after he's introduced to her by Diana, is like he has a memory of that in here, but like it's there earlier, like when they first meet, and he ends with that page after. Like, look at this page, and I love his faces, by the way. Where we're on page 54, the poor bastard, and he's just like melting in front of the phone, and he's just lying there, and he has that page where they're like so in love. And that's his.
Yeah, I know.
That's his ideal.
I noticed that page where they were in love and in the park, and I thought, oh, that should have come at the start instead of on page 54, because it would have made the first issue.
Yeah, but when he's doing these, he's assuming you've.
Yeah, sure.
Like in Paying For It by Chester Brown, they're having a discussion, and then he's like, he's not, like Seth's not approving, but Joe's also not approving, and. In his endnotes at the back, which Chester has a lot of, he says something for that page like, Joe would like you to know that he wouldn't go to a prostitute, not because he's cheap, which he is, but because he's a true romantic, which he really, like, love is really important to him. And there's a part when he is kind of sort of flirting with those girls where he says, love is really important to me. When that girl wants to cheat on her musician boyfriend and he's on the phone with her, he's like...
But then he has to recognize the contradiction of him wanting only a specific type of physical type of person.
That's his neurosis.
Yeah. But he must know he's neurotic. He has to know it, right? Because he's chosen those moments. He hasn't chosen some other random...
He might choose them because he knows it makes good conflict. It makes good story. Like that thing about Seth being on the treadmill. It's hilarious. Seth, did Seth actually say that? Seth is extremely charismatic, so he could. But, Seth is quite sharp in this book. There's a later issue in that last Spent storyline where they're sitting at a table in a diner, and Joe, in characteristic fashion, doesn't order anything, and he, his usual method is, "Oh, you're not going to finish that? Let me eat it." So he saves his money that way, and so Chester and Seth order something, and then they get bread with it, right? And then Joe says, "Can I have some of the bread?" And then Seth says something like, "Well, you should order something," and then they have a little bit of argue. And then in the comic, Seth picks up the bread and he licks it all. And he says, "Okay, now you can, take some." He really rubs his face in it. And when I saw Chester last time and we were talking about Joe's comics, and we were talking about how his comic affected relationships, he said, Seth was never easy with it being in his comics, and he said when he saw that moment, which never happened, Seth never did that, then he was really upset. So it's a weird thing where he's playing with the...
Okay, so this is what I was getting to before about whether he was caricaturing himself. But maybe, okay, so let's say that's the true Joe Matt in The Poor Bastard and in Peep Show. What about the other people? Because you also sent me a link to this interview with the girl that he was attracted to and cartooned all about his lust for her and the effect this had on her several years later down the track. And some people actually recognized her amazingly from his cartoon drawings of her.
Which speaks to a certain amount of skill, no?
Yeah, sure, of course. There's nobody's questioning that.
Yeah, because what we're doing is we're talking about the sensationalism of his practice and his life, and we're not talking about any of his techniques, which is fine. I just want to acknowledge that.
Yeah. So, but this girl seemed to say that the conversations they had didn't go that way.
Yeah.
Or the way he presented himself, or...
And of course, at the very end of this book, he runs into Kim and, I forget, Andy. And they're furious with the way he's represented things.
Yeah.
So it's quite possible that she never was interested in him, and he's totally either made that up in his mind, or he's just kind of pushing things for the... Because he says, it's not you, it's the character, and he tries to defend it. And in Spent... he's kind of looking over the fact, him as a character is looking over the fact that he's producing art even slower and slower, and he looks back at the old issues and he looks at the end with Laura and her roommate, and he says, why did I even do this? That's not what happened.
Right.
So there's definitely some hint that some of this stuff although he may be very reluctant to really admit or interrogate himself as to what he's doing, he may just be kind of rationalizing it as he goes.
Right.
In the same way he rips people off.
So we're talking about there's a threesome at the end.
Yeah.
Which just
maybe never happened.
It seems pretty unbelievable. Somehow, something about it was
What's unbelievable to me is that he goes so long and is so desperate and does not have sex. That's what is unbelievable to me. Because... the thing we can all relate to him to some degree. That's why we find him fascinating.
But there's this kind of porno dialogue quality to it at the end, you know.
Right.
There's it's all got an air of
we like big cocks and
it's all
and we're totally easy.
Yeah. There's something.
But he said in that later issue in Spent that he was trying to force a conclusion, and that's what he was doing with that.
Right.
Force a climax.
Yeah.
Both
happy ending.
Yeah, which he didn't achieve physically.
Yeah.
And perhaps not even artistically.
Yeah. It seemed. Yeah, it's very hard to. I don't know. I just felt like the later, as it got better, I just felt like it had to be further from reality. You know what I mean? Like I felt at the beginning when it was really rough reading that first issue, I was like, "Whoa, this is raw and real."
But like once again, if you read some of those early strips, what he does is he sort of primes you to believing it's real, and you want to believe it's real.
Right.
Like this is
Right.
one strip he had called "My Darkest Secret," and it was one of those one page, and he had tons of little things, and like the kind of the title had a thing where he was like lifting a manhole cover or something, and he had a gas mask on, like it was like this foul thing. And it was about, like, I think it was a trip to New York, and he didn't have a girlfriend, and he was really desperate, and he sneaks into a porno theater, and he gets propositioned by prostitutes in the porno theater, and one kind of just won't take no for an answer, and comes up to him, and even then he's like debating the price with her, right? He's trying to weasel the price down, and she finally goes, whatever, and then she gives him a hand job, and then they go outside, and once he's outside the theater, like he looks at her and he goes, oh my God, she looks awful, she's got like drug sores and whatever, and at the end he goes, what did you expect? It is my darkest secret. And you read that like early on, and you're just like primed for this guy will like tell you like the worst about himself. And so you just, in an odd way, you sort of trust him, his fictional self, even though you feel like you wouldn't trust him in real life. You sort of trust him artistically, and he's good. He's good at what he does for a while. And I would say he's good here. But let's go back to talking about the Frankie character in that art. Did you read the whole thing?
I did. I read most of it. What did you want to say about it?
Okay. Well, apologies if I'm talking too much. Just
No.
But I thought what was interesting about it is, like, I think you can like disagree with like his representation of you. I think that's totally fair. But she wasn't really that much in it. She was just sort of a distant object of affection that was in some ways the beginning of the end of their relationship. But I think her whole claim that I should have been given some money for my representation, or like, I thought that was total bullshit.
And there's even talk about, could you sue him?
It was
or whatever.
It was just an attempt to like attack somebody.
Not even attack. I think it was like grasping at straws.
Yeah.
Because to me, if I don't know, if you lust after somebody and you draw a picture of that lusting after somebody, that does not defame that person's character. He didn't do anything to make her look bad.
All he does is he shows how pathetic he is.
It's not like she wouldn't be able to get a job. Like somebody saw the comic, it's like, whoa, this guy lusted after you, I'm not going to give you this job. That's not how it works.
She makes this ridiculous claim that she and Trish might have been great friends, and that was kind of somehow real.
Well,
which I think is also. I think
you can say that about any relationship. Any relationship could have lasted longer if XYZ didn't happen, even if it didn't appear in a comic book. You know what I mean? So even if he hadn't put that in the comic book and Trish found out that he lusted after her, that would be that relationship.
There you go.
Her friendship with Trish.
There you go.
Right? It had nothing to do with whether it appeared in the comic or not.
So I think that's really interesting, because it's somebody who's not a comics reader's kind of take on this whole stuff. And back then, like now, comics have become much more accepted and, more mainstream. And so in some ways, they're kind of regarded more like a book. So we're treating them with some of the same kind of considerations we treat with a book. And so just like with a novel, if somebody had based, a character on their interaction with, whatever, like nobody would say, oh, you got to pay me, or you got to like let me see it before, I can decide whether you print it or not. But
it's crazy because he changed her name too.
He changed her name,
and it's a drawing. It's a cartoon drawing of her. She's as good as it looks.
She's a peripheral character, but I think the whole thing about Rick Trembles, who interviewed her, he used to do a weekly strip back in the day, and I think, I don't know, maybe he's a frustrated cartoon, who knows, but it's like they're sort of setting up this whole thing in their interview. It's not an objective interview by any means, but I just think it's kind of interesting. You get her on one end, And then you get his fans on the other end, just like sort of writing in these letters, just slamming him. They're treating him like the nerdy kid at high school, where you make yourself feel better by, beating down on.
But I did find it interesting what she was saying about how their conversations did not go down the way they did.
What did she say again?
I can't remember. What did she say? That like he was more nervous or less nervous, or didn't say anything?
She said she had no idea he was interested in her because he was just totally like quiet and So he's definitely accentuating his like facial features, his rubbery body language, which is some of the craft elements that I love.
Yeah.
He's just totally accentuating all of that, like the extreme nervousness and the glances, his facial motions.
Yeah.
I mean, if any, I think Trish definitely has an issue here, but she's asked him many times not to include herself in the book.
Right.
And it's his relationship.
That's true.
He doesn't care, like, he cares more about himself than the relationship. That's obvious.
Right, and getting a comic out of it.
Yeah. And being, both of us being writers ourselves, there is some sympathy with somebody who wants to write and not be fettered by, other people's kind of demands on what you do. But at the same time, he does treat her pretty brutally. But at the same time, he chronicles himself doing that.
Yes.
It's his sort of like, it's his way out. He says, look, I'm doing this. I'm making myself look bad. But at the same time, he's doing it. He's using that.
Yeah.
And so it becomes like this thing he can't get out of. He creates a trap from. So that's what I find interesting about him.
Sure. Yeah. So how do you feel this? Because I haven't read the others. So there's Fairweather, there's Spent, and there's the one Peep Show. Okay.
Yeah.
How do you think it's? Where do they stand? What's your favorite of them, or least favorite?
It's always tied to my experiences.
Yeah.
So just because I discovered Peep Show first, I just remember, like, I lend that to people who wouldn't read comics because back then, especially girls, and I remember actually lending the issues on The Poor Bastard to someone I was seeing. I wasn't really dating her because she was crazy and she wouldn't. Anyway, but the irony about it was she lived near the jet fuel and she would sleep with me. I feel like I shouldn't say any more details, but anyway, she finally got sick of me, and I guess I always hoped we would go out, but whatever. And she was pretty, and we were both young, like I was maybe like 20 and she was 19 or whatever. And she was very pretty, and she, loved to read and stuff, like she could read a book a day. But anyway, I introduced her to the jet fuel after these guys introduced me to the jet fuel. And so she would go to the jet fuel after, like, wanting no more to do with me. Once I was at the jet fuel with Seth and Joe, and Joe goes, I've been looking at this girl, and he was doing the same thing in the comics. I've been looking, and I look over, and it's her, and she's reading a book, and of course she looks very pretty, and I go, oh, and then like Joe turns to me and he goes, do you know her? And I forget what I said, but being like fairly embarrassed, I said, oh, I know her, but you don't want to get involved with her. She's really difficult. But he was like totally doing his thing. And it was very weird because it was... Anyway, so to some degree, I kind of lived through a little bit of this.
Right.
And the VCR thing too, right? So to me, I really like these issues. And I lent those issues to her. Uh-huh. So it had a weird circularity.
Yeah, totally.
But I loved Fairweather because he was doing something different, and he got so much flack from his fans in the letters pages. But I think it's lovely. It's contained. It's like a really good use of his talent. It harkens to all that nostalgia that he loves. And then after that, that's when things... Like, I collected all those issues afterwards, but it was tough because they would be like a year apart or more. And... So I think there's no question about it. Spent is the worst, but I think you got to read it all as a whole, and you got to really start with the first book, the first collection, because it is kind of like an organic chronicling of himself as he grows, and I think it's really the two to read are Peep Show and then The Poor Bastard. You could read this on its own
Fairweather.
or not, but it's better if you have read the earlier stuff. You know?
Okay.
Yeah. But highly recommended. I still, just like I like Concrete and people sort of have forgotten about it, I still like this stuff a lot just because it's very accessible. It's very much about storytelling and about characterization and about, you know. Are you wrapping things up? Is that what you're doing?
Yeah, that's a great place to end it.
All right.
I think. Cool.
This is Tim back in 2023. Hope you enjoyed this flashback episode. Coming up on Wednesday, Emmett and I will be talking about the last 3 Commandy issues with Jack Kirby involvement, only drawing, written by Jerry Conway. So we'll see you then for Commandy. This is Tim, and thanks for listening to Deconstructing Comics.